The moment you go online, you are recorded as having gone online. You leave a print. People know roughly where you're coming from, and they know you've entered a site. And once you've entered that site, it can say where you're going in that site, where you don't go in that site, what you look at, what you don't look at, what search terms that you use, what documents you decide to display, and how long you're there, and where you go next. And by putting all those things together, we can begin to develop characteristics of information-seeking behavior and use in cyberspace. It's very, very simple, and it's done automatically, which is the beauty. And anybody could do it, essentially, but don't.
Privacy matters because we all need a margin of discretion around our lives so that we can exercise some control over them. The fact of the matter is that we've already long ago given up much of our privacy as soon as we started to email and use mobile telephones. But if you thought about what it would be like if your neighbours knew details of your bank account or your medical record or could listen into your quarrels with your spouse, you would be very disconcerted because you would feel that you were losing control over areas of your life that just belong to you. That's why privacy really matters. And the great worry that we have in the digital age is that we've already given so much of it up, both to private agencies and to public ones.
I think that people have patchy understanding of data on the web. It's such an enormously complex subject. You know, retailers might use data in a completely different way to search engines. You know, I don't think anybody has ever had access to Google's search algorithms and what that means if you are suddenly at the top of the search when you look for something, or if you suddenly fall to the bottom. You know, that's something that's very murky and behind the scenes. But similarly, I think that retailers, by and large, have a pretty good, open, transparent policies. They tell you what they are doing with your data. You read terms and conditions. You know, we were always tried to be very transparent with rmbusinesslastminute.com, like every, you know, proper retailer now. So I think it's enormous varying degrees. I think the big piece that's obviously come from nowhere in the last few years, the hot topic of social media. I think that people are only beginning to understand what it might mean to post things about yourself in a public forum that then might be looked at by people that you work with, or might be looked at by people that might employ you in the future. Or, you know, that whole area, I think, is where people are now only beginning to have a think about what that might mean for them.
Well, I think this generation has a sense that information wants to be free, and information about themselves wants to be free. And in a way, there's a kind of self-surveillance that I think that young people don't think about in political terms. But it is a political issue. People put their lives on the screen. They put really intimate details of their lives out there, and with very little thought that there might be people using that information in ways that are not benign. I did an interview with a 16-year-old that is precious to me, because he talked about how he knows that people, you know, can read his email. He knows that people, somehow he senses that his texts are being saved in some server in the sky. But he, when he wants to have a private conversation, he goes to payphones, and he feels that payphones are the only safe place for him to talk. I mean, you have this sense of even young people looking for the interstices of the system to find a little privacy. I don't think this is good. I think that, you know, my grandmother, who came from a European background, taught me how to be a citizen at mailboxes in New York City, where she brought me down to the mailboxes. She said, you know, unlike in Europe, where, you know, bad governments would read your mail and open your mail, in America, it's a federal offense. She's saying it's a federal offense to read somebody else's mail. And that's what makes this country great. That kind of privacy is what gives you rights as a citizen. So in a way, I learned to be a civil libertarian. I learned to be an American at these mailboxes as a kid. You know, I don't know where to take my daughter to teach her that. When we go through the Mass Pike and there's Easy Pass, my car is tracked, you know, there are surveillance cameras all over. We're both giving up unprecedented amounts of information in profiling. I think that it's hard to teach the relationship between privacy and democracy, and it's also hard to teach the relationship between intimacy and privacy. You know, what is intimacy without privacy? I think this is really a question for this generation.
The trick with online materials is everything is persistent by its nature, right? That's one of the powers of the internet. And we think of it really as a useful affordance, right? Because if something is persistent, that means you can get access to it at a different time. Right? That's the opportunity for asynchronicity. But it's also how this material is available 10, 15, 20 years later. And right now we're in that moment of transition, that point of absolute confusion, the uncertainty of, what does it mean that you have everything up there? Down the road, it just becomes the way things are, and it's interesting to see the individuals for whom that's already part of their story. And that's the power of the early adopters, right? So I think about it, I've been blogging since, 1997. That's a really long time at this point. And sure, you can go back and you can read all sorts of things about me as a teenager, working out all sorts of issues. Hopefully you won't. But more importantly, it's about constantly moving forward. And so if someone wants to engage with that level of stalking and see my teenagedom, they can. But you have to read it in the light of the whole shift. And so I think for the teenagers today, they're going to be living out their teenage lives in this very persistent, very searchable manner. But 10, 15 years from now, it's going to be part of a longer trajectory, and the people are going to be looking at the things they're doing as 20-somethings. And sure, we look back and go, oh, that was stupid what I did when I was, 14. And it always was. But when you have this cultural element where everybody's got this track record, it's not going to be as shocking as it is right now for the people who are learning that and figuring it out.
Every single time we go online, every time we look at a website, every time we send an email message, every time we make a phone call with our mobile telephones, we're exposing ourselves, we're stripping ourselves naked to the view of anybody who is interested to find out what we're doing. We know already that private agencies are keen to look at the pattern of use of the internet that we indulge in so that they can target advertising at us. And governments in the Western world, indeed in the world at large, are anxious to keep a record of who people are talking to, what kind of information they're finding out, so that they can detect patterns of that suggest crime or terrorism in the offing. And in all these ways, therefore, we expose ourselves to view through the use of these devices. Not that we would want to give up using these devices, they're just so useful to us, but they do expose us to scrutiny.
Well, there are a variety of threats to privacy online. The worst case scenario would be when information about a person is collected by a large, powerful institution, whether public or private, whether government or corporate, in a way that is used profoundly to their disadvantage, and where the individual has no control over the usage of that information. So it could be to conduct surveillance on people, and in fact, it is so much easier now to collect so much more information about what people do, what they read, what they see, what they buy, that in the hands of a government that has no respect for civil liberties, if you can imagine the sort of post-9/11 world run amok, there's an enormous threat that it would be used to silence political opposition and political opponents and enforce a kind of authoritarian regime. That's the scenario I worry about.
One of the biggest innovations in surveillance in the past few years has come about as a result of the spread of social networking sites and of social facilities and all sorts of other sites. Because once people make visible who their friends are, it's possible to do clustering analysis and start looking for covert communities. Now, in the old days, this was difficult. You had to send out your field intelligence staff to live in the villages and ask who was friends with whom and who was related to whom and so on. And you would then, if people had phones, you'd look at their itemized phone bills and you'd look at which households were phoning whom. But nowadays, information on who is whose friend is available on sites like Facebook and the 40 other such sites that there are worldwide. For example, there were some researchers at MIT tried to figure out if they could use Facebook to find out who was gay and who wasn't. So they crawled the MIT part of the Facebook web, and then they marked as gay those people who declared themselves to be such on their Facebook web pages, and then looked at the clusters of friends and marked as tentatively gay those people who were friends of a whole lot of gay men, and worked outwards from that. And by means of this, they managed to identify 10 of their friends whom they knew were gay but not out about it, simply because of their pattern of acquaintanceships. Now, exactly the same sort of thing works with Islamism, or with stamp collecting, or butterfly collecting, or playing the Irish pipes, or any other human activity. It's possible by mapping social networks to figure out affiliations that people aren't necessarily overt about. And this is an enormously powerful tool in the hands of the police and intelligence services in finding out who adheres to some particular disliked belief.
Again, what constitutes private information, right? From an adult's perspective, it's identifying information is their absolute fear, right? The idea that it's your name, your address, your phone number, anything that will identify you. And this has to do with the idea of physical risk. But for young people, it's about all right, fine, you can call me by my name. Why is that a big deal? It's more about the things that make you vulnerable. And so when we think about privacy and private information, it's really a question of vulnerability. And so from adult perspective, we're really concerned about physical vulnerabilities and increasingly about psychological vulnerabilities. And for a lot of young people, it's about social vulnerabilities. So, how do I make certain that I don't get teased, harassed, bullied because of the things that I make available out there? How do I make certain that what I put out there makes me seem cool and not lame? How do I balance that? So the social vulnerability is the privacy fight for young people. The physical and psychological is the fight for parents. And so we see these two constantly at odds.
So it's very important to recognize that our need, especially for young people, to express ourselves and to share our lives with the world is not something that's produced by or caused by media. On the other hand, the development and especially the ridiculous success of social media fuels this need, right? Facebook earns its money off this need and exploits this need very, very well, if you will. And if you couple that with the fact that if you're young, if you're between, let's say, younger than, let's say, 25, naturally, most of the work that you're doing about yourself is about yourself. Like most of the things you're thinking about have to do with you. So once you get older and you become more part of the world, your interests tend to shift more towards the world. But if you're younger, if you're 13, 14, 15, then the world is you. And so it's logical that younger people are much more self-revealing than older people.
A massive generational difference in how people see the web, and that's one of the things that I find most interesting and exciting, not only just between classic generational breakdowns, but much more split and atomized fragments of early 20s to late 20s to mid 20s. It's more about kind of the stage of life you're at as well, I think, and where you are in the education cycle. If I look now at how 8, 9, 10-year-olds use the web, it's completely different to how somebody aged 18 would use it, completely different how I would use it again. And I think that one of the issues around the privacy questions that are now being raised are, have we taught children how to be safe online enough? And are we, aware enough, if we've come at this later with technology, of all the different ways that information is used? So there's definitely a piece of education that needs to underpin all of the developments that are happening in technology.
Most people are unaware of how exposed they've made themselves. You talk to young people, for example, who've got their own personal blog sites or their presence on YouTube or Facebook, and that they may come to regret doing some of the things they did on video on the internet, or saying the things that they did, especially when they start applying for jobs and employers begin to look back through the digital record of these people, the trace that they've left in the public domain. But quite unaware, every single day that we do something digital, we are potentially leaving a trace out there, and that if somebody wanted to find out where we were shopping, what we were doing, who we were communicating with, why we were doing it, what websites we were logging on to, they could do it. It's a very, very exposed set of media, these electronic communication devices that we now use. And the point is that they're fantastically convenient. And none of us would willingly give them up. But what we would want, if we really thought carefully about what it meant whenever we use these devices, we would want much, much greater individual security for our communications.
It's good to now and then be able to take a step back and realize that the version of yourself or the versions of yourself that you've produced online are only partly you. And that the parts that you don't share are at least as interesting as the part you do. They make up who you are. And so it's in both instances, I would say, like, we need some tools to now and then take a step back.
Yeah.
Even though I realize that's very hard because we live in media.
I'm a positive person and an optimistic person, and I think that the web has reinforced what I believe about human nature, was that it's good, and it's, when put together, it can create great things. You know, I find the web a friendly place. I don't like this extremist view that the web is suddenly a danger zone where unpleasant people can more easily find their vulnerable targets. You know, that's the extremities, as it always has been in every society. And as long as you educate to make people safe, I think the bulk of what happens in the web is interesting, exciting, supportive, fun, entertaining, and magic.